December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. An American infantryman crouches in a frozen foxhole, temperature 20 degrees Fahrenheit, snow everywhere. He hasn't taken his boots off in 3 days. His feet are numb. Not the kind of numb that goes away when you warm up. The kind that doesn't feel like anything anymore. He pulls off his boot. His sock is soaking wet. From the inside, not from snowmelt, from sweat that has nowhere to go. The moisture has been trapped against his skin for 72 hours. In freezing temperatures, ice crystals have formed in the fabric. His feet are pale, waxy, swollen. He can't feel his toes when he touches them. Trench foot, the beginning stages. If he's lucky, if it gets worse, it's frostbite, tissue death, amputation. 300 yards away, across the German lines, an enemy soldier sits in similar conditions. Same forest, same temperature, same snow, same 3 days without changing boots. But his feet are dry, warm enough. No numbness, no tissue damage, no fear of amputation. Same war, same winter, same desperate conditions, completely different outcomes. The American soldier doesn't understand it. The Army issued him specialized winter boots, the M1944 shoe pack, designed specifically for cold weather operations, made by United States Rubber Company and other manufacturers with decades of experience, tested, approved, standard issue for winter combat. So why are his feet freezing while the Germans aren't? The answer comes down to one fundamental detail, one critical design choice American engineers made when they created the shoe pack, a choice that seemed logical, seemed practical, seemed like good engineering until soldiers tried to survive winter combat in them. To understand how the United States Army failed its soldiers so catastrophically, we need to go back to 1942, to the Eastern Front, to a simple pair of boots that would keep German soldiers fighting through the worst winter of the war. Before the shoe pack froze thousands of American feet, before United States Rubber Company engineers drew their first blueprints, there was the Filzstiefel. The German Army invaded the Soviet Union in summer 1941 without specialized winter equipment. The catastrophic winter of 1941-42 taught them brutal lessons. Thousands of soldiers suffered frostbite. Units lost combat effectiveness not from Soviet attacks, but from cold weather injuries. The Wehrmacht needed solutions, fast. German engineers studied what worked. They examined the Soviet Valenki, traditional Russian felt boots that had kept peasants warm for generations. They adapted the concept for military use. The result was the Filzstiefel, the felt boot. The first Filzstiefel appeared around December 1942, issued primarily to troops on the Eastern Front. The design was straightforward, thick felted wool throughout most of the boot, with leather reinforcement at the base and sole. Gray-white or brown in appearance, simple in construction, functional above all else. The German approach was direct. Wool breathes. Wool insulates even when damp. Wool wicks moisture away from skin. Wool has been keeping feet warm for thousands of years, so build most of the boot from wool felt, reinforce where necessary with leather. Each Filzstiefel combined compressed wool, felt for the upper portions, with leather for structural support. Thick enough to provide serious insulation, dense enough to hold shape, flexible enough to allow natural foot movement. A leather strap with buckle at the top allowed adjustment. The German military issued them as standard winter equipment for Eastern Front operations. Not everywhere. These were specialized boots for extreme cold theaters. Not for the Western Front initially, not for Africa, but for the frozen expanses of Russia, they became essential issue for infantry, armor crews, artillery teams, anyone operating in winter conditions. The performance was remarkable in those conditions. Soldiers could wear the Filzstiefel for days in sub-zero temperatures. The felt structure allowed moisture vapor from sweat to escape continuously. Air circulated, feet stayed relatively dry from the inside. The wool insulation worked even in extreme cold, 15 below 0 Fahrenheit, 20 below, 30 below during the brutal Russian winters. The felt maintained its insulating properties. More importantly, the boots worked during actual combat operations, long marches through snow, hours standing guard in frozen positions, days without the ability to change socks or dry wet boots. The Filzstiefel kept performing. German soldiers on the Eastern Front came to depend on them during the winters of 1942 through 1945. Wehrmacht troops fighting in the Arctic regions of Northern Europe trusted them. Mountain units operating in winter conditions relied on them. The system had clear limitations. The felt could become saturated with water if soldiers had to wade through deep streams. The boots weren't designed for wet, muddy conditions. They were winter equipment for snow and dry cold. The felt leather construction meant they weren't as durable as standard marching boots. But in snow, in dry cold, in the conditions where frostbite was the primary threat, they worked effectively. The key was that material choice. Wool felt for the upper boot, minimal barriers to moisture vapor, breathability throughout most of the structure, just permeable, insulating wool that had evolved over centuries as an effective cold-weather material. American intelligence officers knew about the Filzstiefel. They'd captured samples, they'd examined them in detail, they'd studied reports from various theaters. They understood that German troops on the Eastern Front suffered fewer cold weather injuries than the extreme conditions would suggest. The evidence was available. The German approach, thick wool, felt construction prioritizing breathability, prevented cold weather foot injuries effectively in extreme cold. So, what did America do? The United States Army Quartermaster Corps looked at the problem of winter warfare. They understood the threat. Soldiers fighting in cold climates, extended operations in snow, the need to prevent frostbite and trench foot casualties that had plagued World War I. They knew specialized winter footwear was essential, something warmer than standard leather service boots, something designed specifically for cold weather operations. The Army contracted with United States Rubber Company, Goodyear, and other manufacturers to develop a solution. The result was the M1944 shoe pack. Development began in the early 1940s. Mass production ramped up through 1944. American engineers approached the problem with confidence. They would build something better than existing designs, more practical, more durable, more versatile, more suited to American logistics and manufacturing. The shoe pack embodied that philosophy. The design used a combination approach: rubber lower section for waterproofing, leather upper section for durability and support, removable felt insoles for insulation. On paper, it looked intelligent. The rubber bottom would keep water out. Soldiers could wade through streams, march through slush, operate in wet snow. The rubber would provide a waterproof barrier. The leather upper offered traditional boot support and structure, familiar to soldiers, easy to manufacture using existing leather-working infrastructure. It reached about 12 inches up the leg. The felt insoles provided the insulation. Thick wool felt inserts that could be removed for drying, replaceable if damaged. Seemed like the best of all approaches. Soldiers were issued with extra insoles to rotate. The boot could handle various conditions, not just dry cold like the German Filzstiefel, but wet conditions too. Water crossings, slush, spring thaw. The rubber bottom would protect against moisture from outside. In testing at moderate temperatures, the shoe pack performed adequately. In demonstrations for procurement officers, it looked functional. In factory quality control, it met specifications. Production ramped up through 1944, hundreds of thousands manufactured, ready for deployment to units heading to winter combat zones. But there was a problem with distribution. The shoe packs were ordered for the European theater in summer 1944, but most divisions didn't receive them until late January 1945, after the worst of the bulge, after the coldest weeks had already devastated units. When they did arrive, soldiers discovered another problem. The boots weren't reliable. Not in actual combat conditions, because American engineers had made a critical assumption. One that seemed perfectly reasonable in a laboratory. One that made complete sense during brief testing periods. One that would prove catastrophically wrong when soldiers wore these boots for days without relief. They'd assumed that waterproofing was more important than breathability, that keeping water out mattered more than letting moisture vapor escape, that a rubber barrier would solve more problems than it created. They were wrong. December 1944 through January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge, American infantry fighting in the Ardennes forest, temperatures dropping below freezing for weeks, soldiers wearing whatever boots they had, many still in standard service shoes with overshoes. Some units would get shoe packs later. Those who did discovered something troubling. That's when troops discovered the truth about the winter boots' fundamental problem. The truth that would be repeated in countless aid stations, in urgent medical reports, in devastating casualty statistics. The shoe packs were contributing to cold weather injuries. The problem was the design itself. That rubber lower section that seemed so practical. It created an impermeable barrier, not just to water coming in, to moisture vapor trying to escape. Soldiers march, they fight, they move, their feet sweat. That's unavoidable. The human body produces moisture constantly. In winter gear, with insulated boots, feet sweat significantly. In the German Filzstiefel, that moisture vapor passed through the wool felt structure in the upper boot and escaped. Feet stayed relatively dry. In the American shoe pack, that moisture hit the rubber barrier and stopped, trapped inside the boot, against the felt insole, against the soldier's socks, against his skin. The moisture accumulated throughout the day. Socks became damp, then wet. The felt insole absorbed the moisture, but the rubber bottom wouldn't let it escape. The water had nowhere to go except to accumulate against the foot. As temperature dropped at night, that trapped moisture could freeze. Ice formed in the felt insole in extreme cold, ice crystals in the socks. The soldiers' feet were pressed against frozen, damp material, pressed against fabric drawing heat away through thermal conduction. The cold penetrated rapidly. Feet that had been warm during the day became dangerously cold at night. Soldiers woke with numb toes, pale skin, early signs of frostbite or trench foot. But here's what made it worse. Soldiers couldn't dry their boots easily. In combat conditions, you don't always have access to fires. You can't always hang boots to dry overnight. You certainly can't carry multiple spare boots for rotation during active combat. So soldiers put the same damp boots back on the next morning. Marched in them all day, feet sweating again. More moisture trapped. The cycle repeated, day after day. The boots never fully dried. They only got wetter. The removable felt insole, designed as an advantage, became part of the problem in practice. Yes, you could theoretically remove it to dry. But dry it where? How? With what heat source? In sub-freezing temperatures during active combat with limited opportunities to establish warming fires. The insole often stayed wet. Some soldiers tried removing it entirely, thinking that would help. But then they had no insulation, just rubber and leather. Their feet froze faster. Others tried to rotate insoles, but in the chaos of winter combat, even simple sock changes became difficult. The casualties mounted, not from enemy action, from cold weather injuries exacerbated by inadequate footwear. Medical officers reported unprecedented rates of trench foot and frostbite. The winter of 1944-1945 became known for its cold weather injury epidemic. Across the European theater, between 46,000 and 71,000 soldiers suffered cold weather injuries, the equivalent of nearly 5 infantry divisions evacuated. More than 15,000 cold injuries occurred during the Battle of the Bulge alone. Soldiers who'd been fighting effectively suddenly couldn't walk. Feet too damaged. Tissue death. Swelling. Infection. Emergency evacuations to field hospitals. Some companies reported 20 to 30% of their strength evacuated for cold weather injuries during the worst weeks. Not from German attacks, largely from inadequate preparation for the severe conditions. Field commanders sent urgent reports up the chain. Company officers documented the crisis. Battalion surgeons filed detailed medical assessments. The pattern was undeniable across multiple divisions. The problem wasn't limited to shoe packs. Many units didn't have them yet, and were suffering in standard service shoes with overshoes. But when shoe packs did arrive, they didn't solve the problem as hoped. Meanwhile, captured German prisoners from the Eastern Front showed remarkably healthy feet despite months of fighting in identical or worse weather. American intelligence officers asked harder questions. They examined captured Filzstiefel more carefully. They interviewed German prisoners about their winter equipment. They studied the casualty differentials between Eastern and Western Front German units. A clearer picture emerged. German soldiers with proper winter equipment, including Filzstiefel on the Eastern Front, were surviving winter combat with healthier feet. American soldiers were suffering massive cold weather injury rates. The conditions were comparable. The equipment was different. The difference was visible in the design philosophy. When you examined a Filzstiefel, you found wool felt through most of the upper boot. Breathable, permeable to moisture vapor. Leather only for structural support at the base, minimal barriers. When you examined a shoe pack, you found that rubber covering the entire lower section, that impermeable barrier, that moisture trap extending up several inches. Army investigators conducted field studies. They measured moisture accumulation in boots under combat conditions. They documented the temperature cycles. They confirmed what soldiers knew from experience. The shoe pack's rubber bottom, while providing waterproofing, created a moisture trap that contributed to cold weather injuries, not through poor manufacturing, not through inadequate materials, through fundamental design philosophy. American engineers had prioritized waterproofing over breathability. They'd assumed keeping external water out was more important than letting internal moisture escape. They'd built a boot that could keep water out but also kept moisture in. The German approach had been different. The Filzstiefel wasn't waterproof. It would soak through if you waded in water, but in snow, in dry, cold conditions where frostbite was the threat, it kept feet drier from the inside. That's what actually mattered in those specific conditions. The cost accumulated in devastating human terms. Tens of thousands of American soldiers evacuated for cold weather injuries throughout the winter. Men who'd survived German bullets couldn't survive the combination of severe weather and inadequate equipment. Hospital units overflowed with frostbite and trench foot cases. Surgeons performed amputations, toes, feet. Some soldiers lost portions of both feet, crippled for life, not by enemy action, by preventable cold weather injuries. The casualty rates shocked commanders. Some units lost more men to frostbite and trench foot than to combat during the worst weeks of winter 1944-1945. Combat strength depleted without a shot being fired. Individual soldiers experienced the nightmare personally. You're an infantryman. You've survived months of combat. You've been shot at, shelled, attacked. You've watched friends die. You've endured everything the Germans threw at you, and then your feet start going numb, not from a wound, from the cold. You can't feel your toes. The numbness spreads. You know what's happening. You've seen other guys evacuated. You know where this leads. You pull off your boot. Your sock is frozen or soaking wet. You have to peel it away carefully. Your skin is white, waxy, dead tissue. You're going to lose toes. Maybe more. And it's not from the enemy. It's from the environment and equipment that couldn't protect you adequately. That was the reality for thousands of American soldiers in winter 1944-1945. Equipment that was supposed to protect them often proved inadequate. Technology that looked advanced on paper was showing critical flaws in extreme field conditions. Engineering that prioritized the wrong variables was destroying lives. Some units tried desperate field modifications when they did receive shoe packs. Soldiers punched holes in the rubber bottoms, hoping to create drainage. It didn't work. It just let water in without solving the vapor barrier problem. Others tried wearing the boots without the felt insoles. That just made their feet freeze faster. A few soldiers who captured German Filzstiefel kept them, wore them instead of their issued equipment. Those soldiers noticed immediate improvement: drier feet, warmer feet, less numbness. The difference was dramatic and obvious, but these were rare exceptions. Most soldiers had no choice. They wore what they were issued or improvised as best they could. They suffered the consequences. They became statistics in casualty reports: cold weather injuries, non-battle casualties, percentages in after-action reports. The Army eventually responded. Emergency modifications to boot design. New models developed, different materials tested, better distribution procedures implemented. By late winter and spring 1945, improved designs and better cold weather discipline were beginning to reach units. But for the soldiers who fought through December 1944 and January 1945, through the worst of the bulge, through the coldest weeks of one of the harshest winters on record, the help came too late. They'd already paid the price. The lesson took months to fully understand. Army investigators studied the problem systematically. Engineers analyzed the moisture dynamics. Medical officers documented the pathology. The General Board examined the cold injury epidemic in detail. The conclusion was clear. The shoe pack had been designed with waterproofing as the priority. That was less important than breathability in dry winter combat conditions. The rubber barrier that seemed like an advantage was actually a fundamental flaw in those specific conditions. The German Filzstiefel worked in extreme cold because it minimized barriers in the upper boot. Wool felt construction, breathable throughout most of the boot. Moisture vapor escaped continuously through the felt. Feet stayed drier from the inside. That's what prevented frostbite in dry, cold conditions. The American shoe pack trapped moisture because the rubber extended too far up. The rubber bottom was impermeable. Sweat accumulated. Dampness in freezing conditions led to cold injuries. The design philosophy was backwards for the specific conditions. It wasn't about materials quality. United States Rubber Company and Goodyear produced excellent products. It wasn't about manufacturing standards. The boots were built to specification. It was about the specification itself being optimized for the wrong priority. American engineers had looked at winter boot design and decided to improve on traditional approaches. Add waterproofing, use modern rubber technology, create a multi-material design. provide removable insulation. They should have studied more carefully why the German design worked in extreme cold. They should have understood that in dry winter conditions, breathability matters more than waterproofing. They should have recognized that wool felt's moisture management properties in the upper boot were essential, not optional. The detail they missed wasn't small. It was fundamental. The entire design philosophy prioritized the wrong variable for dry, cold conditions. They'd solved for wet conditions when dry, cold was the primary threat. When you're fighting in snow, in dry, cold, in winter forests, external water often isn't the threat. Internal moisture is. Your feet produce sweat constantly. That moisture needs somewhere to go. If it can't escape, it accumulates. Accumulated moisture in freezing temperatures means cold injuries. The German engineers understood this for Eastern Front conditions. The Filzstiefel was designed around moisture management in extreme cold, minimal barriers in the felt upper, continuous breathability, leather only for structural support, simple, effective, proven in the worst conditions. American engineers missed this priority for dry, cold conditions. They added extensive moisture barriers and thought they'd improved the design. They'd actually created a boot that contributed to cold weather injuries in specific conditions. The human cost was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest 46,000 to 71,000 American soldiers suffered serious cold weather foot injuries during winter 1944-1945 across all theaters. Many required evacuation. Hundreds required amputation. All experienced severe pain and often permanent consequences. These weren't acceptable losses in exchange for tactical advantages. These were largely preventable casualties caused by inadequate preparation and equipment. Soldiers disabled by the environment and insufficient equipment. Men who survived German attacks only to be crippled by cold weather injuries. After the war, military procurement changed. New winter boot designs incorporated the lessons. Better cold weather training was implemented. Emphasis on foot care, sock changes, and proper equipment use became standard. The Korean War saw improved designs, though still with challenges. Modern military cold weather boots use sophisticated layering systems, breathable insulation, moisture-wicking liners, designs that prioritize letting sweat escape. Some specialized designs use vapor barriers correctly, but as part of a complete system with proper rotation and care protocols. Because the lesson was finally learned, through thousands of frozen feet, through desperate field reports, through the stark comparison between soldiers who could still fight and soldiers who couldn't walk. The detail America missed wasn't hidden, wasn't secret, wasn't even particularly subtle. It was there in the German Filzstiefel, visible to anyone who examined them and understood the conditions they were designed for. Breathable wool construction throughout the upper boot, minimal vapor barriers, leather only for structural support, just material that allowed continuous air circulation and moisture escape through the felt. That was the approach American engineers should have studied more carefully. They looked at the Filzstiefel and saw limitations. No waterproofing, felt construction, seemingly simple. They should have asked better questions. Why wool felt? Why so much breathability? What specific conditions was this designed for? What problem was it actually solving? The shoe pack serves as a lasting reminder about the danger of adding features without understanding their consequences, about the value of studying why existing solutions work before trying to improve them, about prioritizing the right variables when lives depend on your engineering choices. It's a reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated approach solves the wrong problem, that adding modern materials doesn't automatically mean better performance, that traditional designs often work for fundamental reasons that clever engineers miss. German soldiers on the Eastern Front trusted their Filzstiefel because the boots earned that trust. Day after day, week after week, through entire winters in the worst conditions, the boots kept their feet healthy in extreme cold. American soldiers learned through painful experience that their shoe packs had critical limitations. In specific conditions, not universally, they did provide waterproofing, but in dry cold, they trapped moisture predictably. That's the difference between equipment designed around the right priority for specific conditions and equipment designed around different priorities. Between understanding the actual problem and solving an assumed one. Between engineering that serves soldiers and engineering that serves assumptions. The detail that made the Filzstiefel work in extreme cold wasn't advanced technology. It was the deliberate choice to minimize barriers in the upper boot, to keep most of the structure breathable, to recognize that in dry winter combat, moisture management through breathability was everything. That's what American engineers failed to prioritize for those conditions. Not a technical specification, a fundamental understanding. A recognition that the German design worked not despite its simplicity, but because of it, because it solved the right problem for extreme cold conditions. Every American soldier who suffered frostbite learned this lesson personally. They understood immediately why breathability mattered. The evidence was frozen to their feet. Sometimes the detail you miss isn't something small. Sometimes it's the entire foundation of the problem. Sometimes it's realizing that you're solving for the wrong conditions, and your improvements are optimized for scenarios different from what soldiers actually face. Breathable construction in the upper boot. That was the critical detail for extreme dry cold. That was what kept feet healthy in those conditions. That was what German soldiers on the Eastern Front had. That was what American soldiers needed to understand better. And that was what American engineers failed to prioritize until thousands of soldiers paid the price. If this deep dive into World War II engineering challenges and their human cost resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Next time, we're examining another piece of forgotten equipment that changed how soldiers survived in combat. You won't want to miss it.